Hi guys, so today's video is going to be a list of 15 different books for if you are just getting into the fantasy genre. Even if you are a veteran of the fantasy genre, I still think a lot of these books are really enjoyable, so they're good either way. But before we get started, if you are somebody who's very familiar with the genre, leave your recommendations down below so that people can use that as a reference as well. And then at the end of the video, I'll have a little poll, and if you ended up recommending something that I also recommended, let me know that. I'm going to be going in order from middle grade all the way to adult, so if you're interested in a specific age range, I will have timestamps in the description bar down below. But kicking off the list would be the Lioness Quartet, sometimes known as the Song of the Lioness by Tamora Pierce. This series has what I call the Mulan trope, which is a girl that goes in disguise as a boy because she wants to learn a specific thing that normally is only attributed to boys. The way our main character Alana pulls this off is she has a twin brother, and he happens to be interested in pursuing the thing that normally is attributed to girls. So they kind of pull a parent trap and switch places. It also has a bit of a school setting, which I know is a really big plus for a lot of people, and it's a bit of a coming of age tale. You get to see our main character Alana as she's growing up, as she's learning new skills. Also, another great thing about this series is that it is kind of within a world of books. So if you end up liking this quartet, there are some other books where some characters end up interacting with the characters from this series. Next on the list would be the Bartimaeus trilogy by Jonathan Stroud. You follow two main characters. One is a boy named Nathaniel, who is a magician's apprentice, and then the other main character is a djinn that he summons named Bartimaeus. When we first start the series out, Nathaniel summons this djinn that he honestly probably shouldn't have. He doesn't really have the know-how when it comes to controlling him, and the interactions between him as a kid and Bartimaeus, who is this ancient being, are hilarious. Bartimaeus also has a lot of really amusing quips and thoughts that the author uses third person and first person perspectives to show. When you're with Bartimaeus, you're in first person, and you also get footnotes because the djinn has the ability to have multiple thoughts at once. But when you follow Nathaniel, you're in third person. Not only is this series very amusing, but it's also incredibly high stakes, and it still to this day I think has one of the best endings to any series that I've ever read. Next on the list would be The Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini. I have to be honest in admitting that I've only read the first two, and it was quite a long while ago, but it was all the rage when I was younger. All my friends were reading it, I read it, I really enjoyed them, and I think that if these books get faulted for anything, it's that they are too similar to some classic fantasy. But you could also flip that and say that Christopher Paolini, as young as he was when he wrote these books, had a very good understanding and love of the genre and created a story that pulls from all of these things that he adores so much. So it's a great entry point for that alone, but also it's just a fun story. It's a boy and his dragon. Who doesn't like dragons? Next on the list, you guys knew I had to bring in some Brandon Sanderson, and that would be The Rithmatist. I would say it borders on middle grade up to the younger end of young adult, and our main character Joel is somebody that while he's flawed, he is so likable, and there are so many amazing themes throughout this story. You really see the struggle of someone who wants to be included, who has a passion for something that they just can't pursue, and you just feel for him. You just wish that he could be involved. On top of that, it's a little bit of a mystery because the premise of the story is that students at the school that Joel is attending suddenly go missing, and now they are trying to figure out why this is happening. And the fantastical parts of the story, the magic system, are amazing. It's our own world, so it makes it a little more accessible. It's our own world, but it's an alternate history. And those little tidbits are really cool and really fascinating. And on top of that, the magic is somewhat centered in geometry and drawing, but then also art as well. It's really, really different, and I had so much fun with it. Now, officially breaking into the young adult books on this list, I'm going to start with a series that I don't usually use the term guilty pleasure read because I don't want to imply that you should feel guilty if you read this, but I honestly can't think of a term that applies to another series more, and that would be The Fallen Kingdoms by Morgan Rhodes. The reason I say that it is maybe a hint of a guilty pleasure read is because the series is so over the top, but kind of in the most exciting way. You are constantly wanting to turn the page. People are dying all the time. You never know who's going to live. Is this person going to come back from the dead? Are these people going to fall in love? Or wait, do they love that person now? The premise is fairly straightforward. There is this continent that has 3 different kingdoms, and we have main characters from these various kingdoms who are all intertwined due to politics. So it's a multiple point of view story, and like I said, everybody's falling in love with everybody and hating everybody at some point in the story, but it really is very silly fun. And if you want to buddy read a series, this is a great one. Next up is a manga series, but also an anime, and that would be Fullmetal Alchemist. It's kind of the opposite of what I was saying about Fallen Kingdoms. This is a story that, while it is hilarious very often, it also has a ton of depth and can be very dark at times, but it's not overly dark, and it's also not grotesque by any means. It has fun moments. You're always rooting for the characters, but it also has some times that are pretty emotional. The setup for the story is that we follow 2 brothers whose mother died, and they tried to use alchemy to bring her back, but the law of equivalent exchange demanded a lot from them, more from them than they actually could give, and one brother lost an arm and a leg, and the other lost his entire body, and his soul had to be attached to a body of armor. These brothers are now searching for the Philosopher's Stone to try to get their original bodies back, and along the way they meet a huge ensemble cast. It's not just about these 2 brothers. You follow a lot of really amazing characters, and all of them have differing shades of gray morality. Next up, we have a standalone story, and that would be a newer one, Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. This particular story is very whimsical. It definitely has fairy tale vibes to it. We follow our main character, Elizabeth, who really wants to have a role guarding and protecting this magical library that sometimes the books in this magical library can turn into monsters. But her hopes and dreams kind of get flipped on their head when one of these monsters escapes, and she gets blamed for it. The stakes are very high in this story, but for some reason it still just fills you with a warm, fuzzy feeling. It's something that you could cozy up with on the weekend and probably get through it over the course of that weekend. It's a fun story. Like I said, it's whimsical, and our main character definitely has her eyes opened. One of the main themes of the book is that the world is not always as it seems, which is a theme that I personally always love seeing in books. Next up, we have another standalone, and that would be Long May She Reign by Rhiannon Thomas. The setup is that our main character is way down the line to take the throne, but everybody before her is murdered, and she has no idea who did it. She has no idea if they're after her now, and she has no idea how to rule. So she's not only worried that she's gonna be killed, that someone's gonna try to assassinate her, but now she's trying to run a kingdom on top of it that she never thought she would have to rule. I absolutely love the trope of the character that kind of has to step up and take over and they weren't ready. I just think it is so fun, because who at some point in their life hasn't experienced being completely unprepared for something? The next story that I'm gonna recommend is one that I think a lot of people might be surprised to hear on this list, because nobody seems to take this story seriously anymore. But it's really good for getting into the fantasy genre, because the fandom is super nice. It takes place in our own world. It just happens to be paranormal. So it's got fantasy elements, but it's very accessible, and that would be Twilight. I know it's really fun to make fun of Twilight. I understand why people do it, but it really is really easy to get into. It's a very, very straightforward writing style. It's told from a character that is intentionally kind of meh, she doesn't have a ton of personality, but that kind of a character allows the reader to kind of insert themselves into the story, and it feels like they're experiencing these things. And if you really like the angsty drama type stories, that's exactly what this is. Along those same lines, as far as a story that focuses a lot on the romantic sides of things and has a really big fandom who is generally speaking pretty nice, would be Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. The series definitely starts off on the easier end of fantasy, and then it progresses to being more fantastical as the story goes on. I'll admit that I only read the first 3, but I enjoyed each book more as I read them. It just happened to be kind of too focused on the romantic relationships for my personal taste, but if that's what you like in a story, then Throne of Glass is a great series for you to start with. The first book follows our main character named Selena, who is currently in prison. She has this mysterious past. She has a pretty intense skill set, and that skill set gets put to the test when she is entered into this competition to become the king's champion, which is basically his personal assassin. Next up, we have a duology by V.E. Schwab, and that would be The Monsters of Verity. This is definitely a little bit on the darker end of stories on this list. It follows a kind of troubled teen whose father is basically a crime boss and a monster. And these two kind of become friends. The world happens to be our own world, but in a very interesting future where terrible acts end up creating different kinds of monsters. And our main male character is one of these monsters who happens to look like a human, but there are specific things that can happen to him because he's not actually a human. And then the other character, she is just somebody who she's never really fit in, she's never really belonged, she's a troublemaker, and they just happen to find friendship in one another. Last young adult series on this list would be the Seven Realms series by Cinda Williams Chima. I actually intentionally wanted this to be the last of the young adult books I talked about because not only do I think that this is a good fantasy story to get into fantasy, but I also think it's a really good fantasy story to go from young adult all the way up through adult. It's not that it feels adult, but it has so many bits of amazing world building, political happenings that are similar to the kinds of things you'll see in adult fantasy. Our main characters definitely are young adult characters. They're very young, they're sort of naive when the story starts. One of our main characters is a princess named Reza who is exceptionally naive when the story starts and maybe a little bit selfish. And then our other character is named Han Alistair, who is a street thief. He has a bit of a reputation, but he might not be as big and bad as everybody thinks. Our main characters navigate love, death, depression, recovery, betrayal. There's just so much going on with these characters throughout this story, and there's a school setting at one point, which I know a lot of people really love school settings. Now for the last few books, I'm going to kick it off with the Dresden Files series by Jim Butcher. These take place in our own world, but we follow a wizard detective who gets called in anytime murders look a little bit not normal. Our main character, Harry Dresden, is the narrator for the story, and sometimes in first-person point of view. Weirdly, I feel less connected to the character because they're so busy describing everything that I don't always feel like I get to know what they actually think about things. That is not the case for this character. He's definitely got his own voice, and his voice happens to be pretty hilarious a lot of the times, very dry, very silly. It's a lot of fun. Our next series would be the Shades of Magic by V.E. Schwab. So we got another V.E. Schwab series on this list. And I actually think she's a really fantastic author, not only for getting into the fantasy genre, but again, she's really good at being somebody who's very fluid between young adult and adult. V.E. Schwab always has really unique premises for her stories, and Shades of Magic is no exception to that. It is very different, and a lot of you have probably already heard the description for it, but basically, if you haven't, we follow a main character named Kel who has the ability to go between parallel Londons, but at one point, something from one London goes to another that shouldn't, and then the stakes get really high and things go crazy. And last on the list is a book that I swear every time I do any recommendations videos, I end up recommending this book, but I just think it's so accessible and easy to get into for so many different reasons. You guys, some of you already probably know what it is, but it's Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. This series follows two sisters, one named Siri, one named Vivenna. Siri is free-spirited and happy and has no care in the world, and then Vivenna is the complete opposite. She's poised and perfect because she has been groomed her whole life to fulfill a marriage alliance with a neighboring kingdom, but the father really likes her a lot more than her sister, and he's like, I can't give you up, so he sends the carefree one instead. The perfect poised sister decides, oh my gosh, my sister is kind of dumb, there's no way she's gonna be able to navigate the politics, and so she decides she's gonna go on a rescue mission. Meanwhile, the clueless sister is clueless, but she might not be as dumb as everybody thinks she is. And then also there's a bunch of people who are returned, who are individuals who died and came back as gods, and there's a cool magic system, and it's so stupid fun, and the magic is fascinating, and the characters' interactions are all really entertaining, and it's basically all political intrigue. It's basically a lot of conversations, a lot of people being sneaky and scheming. It's like if House of Cards had magic and was more fun. It's really fun. That's it for 15 different stories that I think are great for getting into the fantasy genre. For those of you that are really into the genre and have made your own recommendations, I'll be really curious to see if you recommended any of the same ones as me. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.